Okay. Hello, folks. Welcome. My name is Ash, and I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm really looking forward to hosting today's event with Koni Benson and André Trantraal about their recent collaboration and work together on Crossroads, I Live Where I Like, a graphic history. For folks joining an event with us for the first time, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 13-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on occupied Cherokee territory. Our bookstore features a wide selection of general interest titles and political thought, highlighting queer, feminist, and anarchist voices in culture. Our entire catalog is available for purchase on our website. So if you haven't checked it out yet, I'll drop links there in the chat. Firestorm is also an event space, but since the start of the pandemic, we transitioned to an online virtual space, and we'll likely continue with virtual events like the one you're attending today through the end of the year. Today's event was also organized in collaboration with our friends at PM Press. We've been collaborating on a series of events with PM Press since the start of 2021, and have a few events coming up on the schedule for August. Notably, a week from today, on August 5th, we're hosting the author and illustrator of the new graphic novel, The Day the Klan Came to Town, which is a fictionalized retelling of one town's stand against the March of Klansmen in small town Pennsylvania in 1923. So if that sounds interesting to you, make sure to follow us on social media, as well as our website's community calendar, which I will also drop links to in the chat. And thanks again to PM Press for collaborating on today's event. One last note before moving on to the event, there will be some time at the end of today's conversation for audience Q&A. So for folks who are attending through Zoom, I'll encourage you to submit questions throughout the discussion by using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. And our speakers will do their best to respond by the end of the event. Okay, great. Like I said before, today's event features a discussion about Crossroads, I Live Where I Like, published by PM Press. Crossroads is a graphic history of women-led movements at the forefront of the struggle for land, housing, water, education, and safety in Cape Town, South Africa. It tells the story of women who built and defended Crossroads, the only informal settlement that successfully resisted the apartheid bulldozers in Cape Town. The story follows women's organized resistance from the peak of apartheid in the 1970s to ongoing struggles for decent shelter today. For folks who haven't gotten a chance to pick up a copy yet, the book offers really beautiful visual representation of many personalities and moments in the daily life of Cape Town. And the book presents a thoughtful and thorough timeline of events at Crossroads and beyond. The collaboration between the writers and artists has produced a captivating, accessible, and in many ways uncomfortable history of Cape Town that has yet to be fully acknowledged. And joining us today is the author and one of the illustrators from this timely work. Koni Benson is a historian, organizer, and educator. She's a lecturer in the Department of History at the University of the Western Cape, where she is committed to creative approaches to history that link art, activism, and African history with various student, activist, and cultural collectives in Southern Africa. André Trantraal is a writer, illustrator, and translator from Bishop Lavis, Cape Town. His work has been exhibited in Amsterdam, Hamburg, and Cape Town, and his political cartoons have appeared in a range of South African newspapers. Koni, Andre, thank you so much for being here today and taking the time to talk with us. And I will go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us. You know, the book has not arrived in Cape Town yet, so you have seen it before we have, and we're just starting to engage people who are interested in the book. So thank you very much. Once we sort of scratched around and learned about your bookstore, there was no way we were going to say no, and we wish we could be there in person. Also, welcome to participants. I recognize some of the names on the list, and it's nice to see some folks from South Africa and from Montreal and from all different constellations, and many new names as well. Andre, do you want to start with how we started?
Okay. Where do I start? Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be able to talk to you, to be able to do this chat. I would say that it started when Koni approached my brother and myself, who's also one of the illustrators on the book, my brother. So she approached us to do a comic about the history of Crossroads, and it was quite a daunting, prospect, because she wanted us to basically adapt a 500-page doctoral thesis into a comic book. And at first we thought we could, squeeze it inside 12 pages, which is what we came up with, estimate for what we thought was going to be the, how many pages it would, happen in. But in the end, it ended up being a lot more, of course. And yeah, so it's been a journey that's been kind of like a few years in the making. Took a lot longer than 12 pages, and yeah, I'm glad to be talking to you guys tonight.
Yeah, I got given Andre and Nathan's comic book called Coloureds for my birthday, which in August 2010. And it's now August 2021, so it's been a very long time. Yeah. We want to share some slides that kind of go into the process of creating the book, and share a little bit about that. So I'm going to share my screen. So it says the host has disabled participant screen sharing. So Ash, I'm not sure how I can share my screen.
Yep, just a second. I will address that.
Well, in the meantime, I will say that I was working on a PhD thesis about organized resistance to forced removals during apartheid and ongoing housing struggles, when I was daydreaming of graphic novels and other forms of creative work, i.e. not writing the thesis. And I think looking at Andre and Nathan's work reminded me a lot of the Boondocks, which I'd been a big fan of for a very long time. And so the idea of possibly turning the thesis into a story that was more accessible, but also in collaboration, was really exciting. But even when we met in 2010, it took years before we put together what became the first comic book in a series that became a series of 6 over many years. Let me see if I can show you now. Okay, good. All right, can you see?
Yeah, I can see.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Cool. So there's the thesis, and then there's the book now. The thesis really is 500 pages long. It's an archive in many ways of about 60 life narratives of a particular case of resistance to forced removals that was actually quite well known. In South Africa, there were 3.8 million forced removals in order to dispossess in land dispossession and relocation to create what were called group areas, racialized groups, group areas. So to segregate neighborhoods and land across the whole country, millions of people were moved, violently removed. And in Cape Town, Crossroads was where the most successful resistance happened, which is quite well known. But what wasn't well known and what I was trying to find out was what happened to those women who became quite famous in some ways. Their story was quite famous, celebrated on the ANC website, the women of Crossroads. But I wanted to know what happened to them after 1994. Did 1994 mean anything? What happened to their issues, really, which was access to public services in the city, and what happened to their histories. So I'll show you a few images. But the book is really a collaboration between art, activism, and African history, and it is a story of two collective biographies, and quite inspired by cultural workers, and try to approach history work as a cultural worker. Tami Minyele, who was an artist who was killed by the South African police in a bombing of the Medu Art Collective's headquarters in Botswana, had said that the art of creating, and I would also say, or history, is not that different than the act of building a bridge. It's the work of many hands. So I'll show you a few slides of the background of the many hands that went into the work. So I was doing research in archives. So here's the archives. These are archival photographs of forced removals in the 1970s in Cape Town. And I'm going to then show you how we adapted some of these images into the comic book. This is a map of the Cape Peninsula, Cape Town, in the 40s and 50s. And all of these dots are what would be considered neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods. And by the 1960s, there was only 3 places where people classified as African but officially live. The rest had been demolished. And apartheid, you know, I mean, for some people will know and some people might not, but it was 4 decades. And the first was implementing laws. The second was actualizing them. And then the second 2 was everything falling apart. And so, whereas there had been mass migration to the city in the 30s and 40s, and then demolition in the 50s and 60s, in the 1970s, there was an economic boom. And the apartheid authorities estimated that there was about 100,000 African people who they considered illegal, because, as you know, apartheid means separateness. And the idea was that there were 11 so-called minorities, with Afrikaner whites being 1, English-speaking whites being 1, and supposedly only 9 other groupings, Xhosa, Venda, Sotho, etc. And so the idea was there was a group area for each race group. And Cape Town, the cities were white, except for workers when needed. And so a blind eye was turned to the increase in workers in the city in the 1970s. And as the economic boom came to an end and a bust, this was when there was mass forced removals across the city, and the stakes were really high. And Crossroads was just an open piece of land at the crossroads of 2 main roads, Lansdowne and Klipfontein Road. And then Crossroads was at that intersection. And it was supposedly a temporary transit camp where people would be weeded out of so-called colored neighborhoods, white neighborhoods, and put onto this field where they were then going to be taken to whichever appropriate Bantustan or homeland according to apartheid authorities. So this is, these are shelters that were being put up in Crossroads in the early 1970s, and women got together and sat down and formed the Crossroads Women's Committee and said, we're not going, we refuse to go. And most of them had survived many forced removals up to that point in time. And most of them had also had children die in the rural areas of starvation and lack of medical attention, lack of food. And so they decided collectively that they weren't going anywhere, and they spurred a kind of local, national, and international campaign. And they literally built this place called Crossroads. Here they actually hand built 2 schools. Many of them were teachers, and they were considered, they had these contracts that were considered broken service, because at that time, if you're a woman and you got pregnant, you weren't allowed to be a teacher anymore because, you know, I don't know. So many of them could teach and were teachers and started these schools. These are some photos of their students. And these were women organizers from that time who I have been interviewing and working with since the mid to like 2005. These are affidavits, and this became a local, national, and international campaign. So it was the Women's Committee that was at the forefront of creating all sorts of alliances with trade unions, with white liberal groups, with women's groups, with lawyers, with the kind of left press. And the camp grew and grew, and over time they won certain rights to stay. There would be demolitions and raids, but they would rebuild and come back. And so from having a few hundred people to a few thousand people, there was about 20,000 people after a few years, and after a few more years, about 100,000 people, all in quite a small area. And women there were a range of strategies: protests, pickets, a play. There was film footage that was snuck out of the country, etc. A lot of posters. If there's any printmakers in the audience, you might appreciate some of these posters from the time. So you can see this poster was even put out by the End Conscription campaign, but it was about, you know, hands off of Crossroads. So it became a rallying cry. Okay, I'm gonna skip through because I wanna show you then what we did with these images. And this is a photograph, for example, of one of the organizers, Nomangezi Mbobosi, telling stories from that time. So I'm going to skip ahead. Eventually, Crossroads was demolished. It was set alight by vigilantes who, after 10 years, then sided with the state and burnt out Crossroads in May 1986. 70,000 people were displaced, and about 30,000 selectively came back in. And after 1994, there was all sorts of lip service because Crossroads made such an important contribution to the end of official apartheid. But this is what parts of Crossroads still look like today. And when the first houses went up in Crossroads, they were tiny and quite ridiculous. And so a group of women got together called the Women's Power Group and staged a 4-month occupation of the Cape Town city, the offices that deal with housing. And it was one of the first and most profound of the kind of post-94, what people called new service delivery protests. So I want to skip ahead to finishing the research work and doing ongoing work with housing organizers. So I spent 8 years working with activists in a place called Zilrain Heights, an occupation in Grassy Park in Cape Town. And the history of Crossroads kept being so important to figuring out, how did we get here? How is it supposedly after 1994 and in a democratic dispensation, and yet we don't have access to houses or water? And when people do set up shacks on open field, they face harsh eviction. So this is a group of women who had occupied in Grassy Park, and we were actually doing work here to map the settlement as part of the anti-eviction campaign. So after years of doing workshops with activists, mostly women activists on the forefront of these movements, it became obvious that this story of Crossroads was relevant in terms of what had happened, forms of strategies, tensions within movements, and the kind of negotiated settlement that happened in the midst of the height of the anti-apartheid movement. And so it was actually the United Steelworkers from visiting, and they were organizing with workers in Brazil, Mozambique, and South Africa, who at first offered to fund some kind of a publication that they could take these histories and stories of not just the anti-apartheid struggle, but ongoing struggles and the ways in which movements had been demobilized and were remobilizing and challenging the kind of Rainbow Nation narrative, that we first got funding for this idea of turning the thesis into a graphic novel. So this is a picture of André and Nathan's book, Coloureds, that first inspired the series. So we did one, and then we did another. We've got funding from Pro Havesha Council of the Arts, from the Department of History, where I then started doing a postdoc, from Ontario union called CUPE. So it was like piecemeal with allies interested in ongoing activist work in Cape Town. And so there's André and Nathan when we were young. And I don't know, do you want to, I can pause, André, if you want to talk a little bit about this phase of the work.
Well, that specific photo was taken at the Cape Town Book Fair. And as part of the Cape Town Book Fair, which is held annually, but I mean, hasn't, since COVID, of course, hasn't been, been held. But yeah, so there's this little part of that actual book festival that is like a tiny comic convention that's kind of folded inside of it. And so, yeah, we were having fun being capitalists, selling comic books. It was, I have to say, I have to probably re-inspect my kind of like socialist credentials, because I think I was having way too much fun selling comic books to people. But yeah, and it was a great, and people would come back to us after they, I mean, like I said, the festival was held is held annually each year, and so people would come back to us like after they bought the book, one of the comics like a year ago or something, because we were also just kind of very slowly producing the books, just like Koni securing funding and so on, and then and people would actually try and find, because they wanted to know how the story unfolded and what happened and so on, and it was good, kind of incentivizing for us. It was very encouraging. So yeah, I mean that's basically what this picture here is kind of a little bit about. Yeah.
And the kind of encouragement was really interesting, that it was both from people interested in comic books, people interested in history, people interested in political education and mobilizing, and then slowly actually also people in academia, which I didn't expect. And to be honest, I left my job at the International Labor Research and Information Group on study leave to do a postdoc, because everyone there was like, you have to finish this thing and you need time to write it. So I went on leave to do this postdoc, and I didn't tell anyone I was working on a comic book. I was like, no, I'm turning my thesis into articles and, making these interventions in history. And then as people started to find out that this was what I was doing, there was a lot of support. And I was very surprised to find that it was taken seriously, as a kind of growing genre. And, there's a lot of graphic novels out there, but at the time, there weren't that many nonfiction graphic novels. And I was even then asked to teach a course. I designed and taught a course on African history through comic books, history for what and for whom. And so it asked questions about representation and collaboration and accessibility and debates in history, but through using graphic novels. So we, here's some pictures of how the thing then came together. So here's some early sketches You can see how some of the drawings are really direct from archival photographs, like this one, for example. Or you can see here how here's the, you know, where the illustrations came from. This image you can see is quite direct from the photographs. And then there are some, so this is also an example of one that's direct, but a lot of the, you know, most people in Crossroads don't have any photos or any documents. The place was demolished so many times that people don't have personal effects, photographs or things like that. So how then do you turn these stories into illustrations? And we tried to also show who was speaking, where, you know, where the story comes from without it being too like citation heavy. So here's a picture, for example, Kailicha, which is today the biggest township in Cape Town. Most people don't know that it was the result of the demolition of Crossroads. So people did not want to go. Kailicha stood empty with these tents. It's 35 kilometers out of town on a sand dune. And it was a compromise after all of the protests against past laws and against the segregated city. The compromise was that people could then build homes in Kailicha, not in the city center. And people refused. And so it wasn't until Crossroads was burnt down and the security police were waiting with vans to take people to Kailicha that these, what became houses, were occupied. But even today, many people are quite surprised to see the kind of early origins of Kailicha as tents. So women in Crossroads, one of the things they did was put on a play and performed their resistance story and kept adding to the play as the struggle unfolded. And depending on which audience they were performing to would also incorporate or highlight particular roles of particular politicians or activists. It was an all women play. They played the role of women and of men. And the play had never been written down. So the oral histories were a way then to write the play out. And it also, for people involved, was a vehicle of a memory of that time. And so then you can see how the drawings then of the play were imagined. You know, what mattered, what details mattered most to different people were really important. So this picture, which is one of my favorites, is a picture of Mama Yanta, who was the first chair of the Crossroads Women's Committee. And when she got evicted, years after, you know, tireless efforts, what was most upsetting to her is that on the day that she was chased out, she wasn't even properly dressed and she didn't have her head covered. And so in the first round of drawings of this particular scene, she had a head wrap on. And it was one of those edits that needed to be done because for her, the important moment in that scene was that her, you know, her hair was, her head was not covered. And that's Mama Yanta inspecting our work at the end of the day. Also the way that the images were placed, you know, I mean, Andre can speak more about this. I'm not an artist and I don't have the right vocab for it in that way, but how to kind of position the various tensions that played out and take something that I might have written, you know, 7 pages about describing. How do you then put that into limited words, although I think the comic is quite wordy for comic people, but really illustrate and show the visuals of different concepts?
Well, for one, it's because it's a thesis. It's and how this particular thesis was written. So obviously, like Koni said, there was a lot of interviews that she did with the different women, and that is quite central. I think to the thesis itself, and so, but in that sense, it's quite easy to kind of just tell the stories that they were actually telling, essentially translating their words into you know, pictures wasn't that difficult. But when it came to sort of like aspects of the thesis where there was, for instance, kind of analysis, commentary, this kind of thing that any academic that is expected to be part of a thesis, that became a little more tricky. And so one of the, I'll go to was very often just trying to rely on things like newspaper cartooning, political newspaper cartooning, editorial cartooning, kind of trying to maybe express what the author is saying in a political cartoon kind of format, expressing some what the writer is saying with words in just often with complex, maybe like a complex issue, complex aspect of the thesis, and expressing that as simply as possible with an image, which is the point of political cartoons. After all, is to make these kind of like kind of like complex issues kind of like accessible and understandable, to ordinary people. So that was one of the things we used. On the specific page that Koni has picked out, it's kind of like essentially just little bits of like juxtapositioning, in this context of this, from what I can remember, is that Johnson Kobawana, sorry, I have a little trouble pronouncing his name, was one of the community leaders, and then Mrs. Ntungana was also one of the leaders, but there was conflict. And so with how the picture is set up is that you can see there's almost like a tear through the page there. And so it's kind of like the idea of them being separated by this tier, and then we're filling in the information that indicates, that gives the specifics of that situation. So you have to kind of come up with little useful ways of kind of just depicting things. And because it's a comic, there are very creative ways, I suppose, of kind of getting your message across of what it exactly is that you're trying to say, to communicate.
Yeah, I'll show a few other examples that I pulled out. I mean, this one with all of the speech bubbles is probably, like pages and pages of different factions debating and fighting strategy, strategic ways forward. So to just have, a range of 4 examples, what the youth are saying, what some of the liberal supporters are saying, in that way was one way of kind of quickly getting that sense. Or the other one of the woman under the umbrella, it was about a research that had been done that asked people after, in the 1990s, did South Africa gain its democracy through war or not? And it was a survey that basically said, most white people said, no, there wasn't war, it was a peaceful transition. And most Black people said, no, it wasn't. I mean, that's oversimplifying, but I think that's how some of the ways that it was then put into the book. We decided not to have footnotes. I think Nathan was very clear at the beginning saying, we all had our like non-negotiables, and he was like, this is not going to be an educational pamphlet. This is, and we looked at examples of comic books that had footnotes or citations, and in the end decided, no, we're not going to do that. But we tried as much as possible. And I think for me, I was like very clear on very specific things that really needed to be referenced. And so I think the illustration was really quite brilliant in the tricks used to then show, for example, just drawing the headline of a newspaper or having somebody speak. And then they're quoting themselves, but also to use tricks like this woman had said, when the pot was ready, she used a metaphor to say basically like when the pot was ready, then the men began to fight about positions on a committee or something like that. But it was about who did the work, who did all of the grunt work. And so to just literally draw her cooking that pot. And then there was others, images of houses that were tiny, or people feeling like when they spoke out, they were shoved back into a sardine tin, or, you know, a dog that's being rewarded for good behavior, those kinds of things. And then just getting a sense of the environment for where there weren't pictures, because there was lots of things that we didn't have direct photos. So to get a sense of the style and the times and, you know, the environment. And there was a lot of illustrating things that were never captured. Meetings. I mean, I think people coming to this talk will appreciate hours spent in collective meetings. You know, it's not glorious. It's not in the press. It's in minutes and minutes and minutes and interesting archives. But how do you then, you know, represent that? This is a moment of the chickens coming home to roost. This is a moment of elites fighting over a kind of sinking ship. I think I'll skip, but those were some of the ways in which we tried to get the messages, the various messages and layers across. And when women from Crossroads read the book now, I mean, many of them had said, please, can you find a way to make this as interesting to our youth as it is to you? And often they say, oh, I remember that day, or I remember that day, even when that day was never written down. So I think for me, that's, you know, that is definitely a moment where it feels like we managed to do some of the things we were trying to do. And I think I will actually just leave it at that as far as the slides go, because it would be really great to have time for Q&A and hear which parts of it anyone might be interested in hearing more about.
Well, great. Thank you so much for that presentation. For folks who are in the audience, there's a Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen there. We already have one question that's been submitted, but if you've got any other questions that come up for you, please feel free to submit them there, and we can get to them now. So yeah, I wanted to kind of just like start off with a question that I think you were kind of addressing towards the end there, but like, who do you hope that this book gets in the hands of? You know, in terms of it being something that was initially a thesis and now has been, you know, collaborated on to turn into this graphic history novel format. Who are you hoping that to get this in the hands of, and what kind of impacts do you hope that it has?
I think first and foremost, the reason why we didn't go for like doing a book right at the beginning and did a series of comic books, in part because we didn't, I mean, we thought we were going to do the whole thing in one little comic book, but, you know, was that I didn't want it to be precious. I didn't want it to be this alienating thing like an expensive book, or the way that a thesis is so inaccessible. Something that you could throw away, something that was, you know, not intimidating in any way. And so in that way, first, I wanted it to be readable and accessible for people in Crossroads. You know, there's, especially that time, like 10 years ago when we started doing this work, I think thanks to the Rhodes Must Fall student movement here, and maybe there's parallels with Black Lives Matter movements in the US, but there's been a crack in the denial of ongoing systemic racism and violence. And about 10 years ago here, there was still such rife denial that things had changed. And I think for people living in communities where things hadn't changed, the history books really quite puzzling, if not completely offensive. And so when students, like all students in grade 9 here across the country, have to do an oral history project, and when they would interview their parents and grandparents about apartheid, it's very awkward and uncomfortable to find resources that could support that work, that acknowledged the kind of continuities. So for me, it was important that it was useful for activists and organizers who continue to face the brunt of a severe housing crisis There's 570,000 families, so about 2 million people on Cape Town's official waiting list for subsidized housing. And so, you know, to go and forced removals were never considered in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And less than 10% of land has changed hands since apartheid ended. So like all of the huge, main, big structural, you know, factors that were at the heart of apartheid haven't changed. So for me, the first who I wanted the book to be for was for either people who had been involved or people who live with the legacies of that involvement or people who are interested in organizing today against some of the same issues. And that could be people in Crossroads, but it could be allies as well. The struggle in Crossroads was, you know, a multi-dimensional, complicated struggle like most big movements are. So that was one. And then second of all, for anyone who looks around Cape Town and is like, how or why, like, how is it that, you know, you come from the airport and you drive to town and it's like shacks and sushi. It's the most unequal society in the world statistically, according to like the Gini coefficient, but it's like this city that is the world-class this and that, gorgeous place to visit, and yet, you know, the most horrific place for many people to live. And so for people who live on that side of the tracks in what's predominantly like, you know, white or middle class Cape Town, and is interested in how is it that this city looks the way that it is? What is the history to that? That, you know, for people who want to know about a history of Cape Town. And then beyond South Africa, I mean, really it's for allies and kindreds who are interested in movement building, in struggles for the commons, in struggles against racism and sexism and, you know, organizing, because I learned so much from those histories from across, you know, the world and time and place by reading, you know, by the books that I've had access to. And so to be able to contribute in that way and to spark conversations and connections. And then lastly, sorry, this is long, but it's also because there is this kind of multiple audiences, but lastly, it's really for people who are interested in challenging these kind of pigeonholes or pockets or boundaries between academia and activism or art, you know, art and, you know, there's art and then there's text, or, you know, you have to be an artist to be interested in art, or you have to be a, you know, historian to write history books, or, you know, where does research, what can and should you do with research, and where do these collaborations happen? So really as like a serious way of saying there's power dynamics in research and there's so many things that could come out of research, and yet there's more and more people getting more and more degrees and producing things that sit on shelves and speak to like this tiny disciplining, you know, committee or whatnot. So in that way also it's to say that this is a history book and it should be used in academic history classes. For me, that's quite important, as well as in activist spaces.
Right.
Yeah, I think.
Any thought there? Yeah.
Yeah. No. What I was gonna say was, is it okay? Okay. Well, what I was gonna say was that my experience with comics is that the kind of people who read, the kind of people who would read Crossroads are the kind of people who generally read comics. And I think what's awesome about comics is that there is a, no one is ever really intimidated by reading a comic. There's a stigma around comics as well that works to its advantage in a way, in the sense that it's seen as a literary, artistic medium, which maybe doesn't have that much to it in the way of, you know, prestige or whatever, you know, one of these kind of things that people attach to just status or whatever. But that, I think, works to its advantage in the sense that it then allows people to kind of just, have the idea that if they pick it up, then they'll probably understand what it's what it's about. No one, and I think we try to draw the book in that way as well, so that it's kind of a disarming kind of thing where it's like, whereas if someone picked up Koni's, PhD thesis, might not, be quite as, encouraged to want to read, this very kind of like, technical kind of, in many ways, kind of academic document or whatever. So I think it helps to just kind of put people at ease and to be like, okay, maybe I don't understand all of the words or whatever the case might be. I can look at the pictures in conjunction with the words and kind of figure out what is being said. And I think that's what's really great about comics in that sense.
Yeah, I saw that there was a question about language, and I think that originally I had thought it would be great to do it in a combination of 3 languages, the 3 languages that are spoken mostly in Cape Town, which would be isiXhosa and Afrikaans and English. And to do one comic that had bits of all 3 languages tied in. But only, at first, the thesis was written in English mostly. Many of the interviews were done through translation in isiXhosa, and then translated into English, and transcribed in Xhosa as well, and given to families in that format, and put in archives in that format as well. But the thesis, because it was written in English, and then we did the first comics in English, but the idea was, if we ever had, access to resources and time, to be able to do it, and not necessarily do it like, here's the Xhosa one, here's the Afrikaans one, here's the English one. And I spent time with Tara Books in India, and they were very keen. With activists and friends, they're very keen to do a version there using, the images, and then, use local languages. But we've never really gotten that far with, or anywhere. We haven't gone anywhere with that daydream. But I think also there are words throughout that are not English, and we use them as people use them in speaking English here. There's Afrikaans words and there's Xhosa words peppered in. And so really it's how people speak, and how people speak even in translation. So when people, none of it was, the interviews were not edited to change how people speak, even though most of them were either done in English or translated into English. Andre, do you want to say anything else about language?
Well, I think it's a very important issue for me, because I do translating as well. For me, I think when you translate, what I find more and more, I would say, is that the realization how much of how much language is personality, and how dialogue is personality. Well, I should say just speech, perhaps, and how much of that is essential to identity, and a person's identity, and how that kind of, for me, the kind of like homogenizing effect that a certain type of standard English has is a big problem in it represents a big problem for translation and for kind of communicating people's personal stories, their narratives, their voice, so to speak. And these are the kind of like big kind of like, challenges and problems that you have to kind of tend to when you do this kind of story, where you're taking essentially a country where people speak, where there's 11 official languages, and kind of putting that into the kind of homogenizing, kind of like mold, I suppose, that is, standard English. So a lot goes missing, essentially, is what I'm in a very long-winded way trying to say. There's a lot that really goes missing, a lot that's very, very important, I believe. And I believe that will become, or if it isn't already, I wouldn't know, but like a very important issue, in further in time. I mean, that's what I think. So.
Yeah, I think, often in the writing that I end up doing, which is often based on interviews, there's editors who always want to correct the grammar and fix the English. And I mean, nobody other than us edited this book in this way. There was no tussles over that. But in so many instances, I find your work is taken and the quotes, people will ask you to just paraphrase instead of have long quotes. And then when you do have quotes, there'll be an editor messing with like the grammar and English within that quote. And I think you're right, Andre, like it's the personality, someone's personality comes through and you can hear somebody speaking. And I think that's in part also what resonates when people read it. They're like, I might not know this person, but I know these aunties. I know, the type. And it's very familiar in that way. And I think writing how people speak is really important, like, to the comma important. Exactly. And I think how that came across in speech bubbles and in particular personalities was really important. And you can also see people's personalities in the way that they posed for photographs. And in a lot of the interviews, like when I did interviews, I also took photographs of people and gave them back, a framed photo and their life history translated and transcribed in audio and paper, because it's for their family. It's for like their, and just the way, like when we were kind of scouring through photos, a lot of the photos we used, there were the photos of people when they were in their 80s, let's say in the 2000s, but then to find photos of them when they were, 30 years prior, and to try to get a sense of how to draw people was also, I think, an interesting part of how do you honor someone's personality and how do you get it right for each individual involved and then as a collective, because the book is really the story of two collective biographies, but within that it's made up of individuals, and that balance I think is really tricky, and it's really hard to know when you're so deep in it, like what can you let go of and what can you say, okay, we only have room for this many pages and this many words. How do you feel like there's enough of a representation there?
Yeah, I'm interested to follow up there, Andre. Both you and there were other illustrators on the project. What were some of the most challenging components for you, and then perhaps the most like exciting and enjoyable moments for you in translating what both exists, it sounds like, through photographs. I'm curious if you met any of the people who you were illustrating, and then also the fact that there wasn't actually visual documentation from a lot of the places or scenes in which you were depicting. So yeah, what were some of the like challenges related to that, and then also perhaps what was like most exciting for you in doing that?
I think one of the biggest challenges probably was where we would kind of run out of like source material, so to speak, in the sense of like, how do you, what the author, what Koni is saying, how, when it's this very kind of abstract almost idea that's being communicated, how do you then kind of find a visual that goes with that complements it or contrasts with it, or whatever the case might be. So that was a bit of a tricky thing to kind of figure out quite a lot of the time. I would say also to also get back to what Koni just said, it was the idea of like, very often there was, you know, reference photos of the women when they were older, but then very often there weren't reference photos of you know, some of the people in the story. And to the extent that one of the you know, one of the bad guys in the story, so to speak, an apartheid era minister, he we did a drawing of him that made him far too good looking because we only had a photo of him in the kind of like when he was older, you know, and he was far too dashing. So yeah, so that was a legitimate criticism from someone who told us that, you know, that guy's far too good looking, man. So there was these kind of like little things that you had to kind of figure out, and like, you know, I know in the movies there's this thing called it, I'm sure you must know, that kind of de-aging thing that, you know, there was a lot of hype around, and, you know, like they made Robert De Niro look, you know, 20 years younger or whatever the case might be. And so in the comic, in a weird way, it was a little bit of doing that as well. So it's like you might have an older photo. You kind of have to figure out how this person would have looked when they were younger. But I think, and we, to get back to one of the other questions you asked now, I did meet one of the women. I only met one of the women from what I can remember. It was, and yeah, so I think from what Koni said, that a lot of the women were very happy with their kind of likenesses. My brother, who was one of the chief illustrators on the book, he's got a talent for doing like kind of flattering portraits, basically. And so yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah. Is there anything I missed? I think I might have missed one of your questions. But
well,
yeah,
I think you got it.
Okay.
Well, great. In terms of if there's any other questions from the audience, I think now would be the time to submit them. Otherwise, perhaps we could move towards wrapping up. I think I have just one more question, sort of about the lessons and impacts of Crossroads and the organizing that took place there, and the ongoing organizing, and sort of you mentioned Black Lives Matter at one point. Sort of like what perhaps are the lessons that could be drawn from an international audience around the sort of unacknowledged, or what is now being uncovered and told on, you know, this level for perhaps the first time, where it's reaching people like us at Firestorm for the first time.
Yeah, I recently did an interview that's up with the Black Agenda Report book forum, and they ask all the authors the same 5 questions. So it's quite interesting to read through what people wrote. And they ask, one of the questions is, what do you want activists and community organizers to take away from your book? Or, you know, what do you want people to unlearn, or what's influenced you? I mean, but they're interesting questions. And I mean, I think for activists and organizers, maybe the parallel for me would be with Black Lives Matter is just the ways in which civil rights histories, you know, we hear about particular leaders framed in a very particular way. We hear about Malcolm X, for example. You would have heard of Mandela. Maybe we would have heard of Biko. But the idea of who is a leader, who is a leader, and what makes a leader, and the kind of work that goes into movement building, collective work, I think is really important. And the kind of politics of like self and collective care in that work. What happens within movements? How do movements almost creates preemptive spaces? How do people behave with each other? What does alliances and solidarity mean? You know, now we might call it intersectionality now, but how are people and a range of their issues brought into spaces? And yeah, what are the strategies and tactics in almost studying what we're up against? Because I think that there is an idea during the anti-apartheid struggle that there was a clear enemy and that there were clear alternatives. And right now in the world, you know, I don't know about there, but here, I think kids are growing up without a sense that there's an alternative to capitalism, that capitalism, it's like as if it's just the normal, like it's the air you breathe. It's not even described as a thing, and that there is an alternative, that it is constructed, and that it's constructed based on violence, and it's reproduced, and how does it work, but also what would an alternative be? And probably, I mean, I know there as well as here, we have a crisis of access to basics, which should be public services and, you know, what we could call a common. So I think that there's a lot in these kind of histories, both about tactics and organizing, but also analysis of what are we up against and what's it going to take to remake and redream and organize, that I think is probably quite similar, you know, like parallel anyways, with on the one hand, all of a sudden there's histories about everything. You can find information about everything. And at the same time, where is there time to collectively digest that, to study that, to put it into practice? So for me, that's what I think this history can do, especially if there's an acknowledgement that it's not only ongoing, but in a way, we have to address a whole phase of demobilization that was never spoken about. So there's this like narrative about democracy and about human rights, right? That you know, we've overcome because things were way worse back then when some people didn't have rights. And the idea that, you know, voting is gonna solve everything so there's a lot of that kind of lip service or an idea of a kind of liberal idea that everyone needs to be uplifted, as opposed to kind of cracking open and rearranging, you know, an entire system. And in Crossroads, the most intense demobilization happened at the peak of the most amazing anti-apartheid victories. You know, Crossroads was not demolished. Crossroads survived. Past laws were, the past laws came off the books, but the reforms that took place reformed capitalism, racial capitalism, in that you would take past laws off the books so anyone of any supposed color could enter the city, but it was then reformulated based on, do you have a house? Do you have a job? And so then the race dynamics remain the same, but there's an assumption that as long as everyone has equal access to being working class, you're okay. So I don't know, for me, I think those are the bigger underlying issues of how do we mess with the chronology and see the various layers going on at the same time and take inspiration, but also without a kind of, without a sense like we're winning, because we're not. But it is possible to, you know, stop things from getting worse or to come up with alternatives and actually implement them. But it's tricky, it's difficult. And I think a lot of resistance histories are romantic, you know, and that doesn't do us any favors, I don't think, in the long run. So I would hope that there's maybe some inspiration and some honoring of stories that need to be told, but also a bit of like difficult reckoning with where we're at, with some very solid like suggestions of possible ways forward at the same time. And I know we're going over time now, so
Oh no, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, and thank you for that answer. Really appreciate it. There were just a few comments in the chat, no more questions, just folks, again, offering their appreciations for this conversation and supporting Crossroads in getting this story out there. There is one person, Lee, who commented with a memory on Winston Mankunku in the mid-1980s, who interpreted Crossroads situation through sonic formations and representations through music, and sort of noting that as a fourth language here, where we're talking, you know, we're talking about words and illustrations, and then bringing music in as well is notable. So thank you for that comment, Lee. And thank you so much, Andre and Koni, for being here today. I think this was a really wonderful conversation, and we were really honored to host it. I will drop in the chat there a link to the book for folks in South Africa. Unfortunately, I don't think we have the ability to ship without some high costs. But hopefully, you said y'all are going to be getting the book there soon, right?
Soon.
Yes, it's on its way.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, thank you to Lee. I appreciate your comment, and I think there's definitely a soundtrack in the making. There's a Johnny Dianti song for a lament for Crossroads as well, and I think that there is definitely another layer of the story to be told. And I know that Rusera is also here, who is an amazing curator of arts, and it would be quite something to take these archives and to make them, you know, come alive in various ways. So I appreciate that comment. And the other person, somebody else had a question, Olivia, and I'm in the history department. And yeah, it's always interesting to hear comparative histories and situations that you wrote about. So thank you for those who put questions in the chat box.
Well, great, y'all. We'll have a recording of this event, so there were more people who had registered. Everybody who registered will receive a recording of the event. So, you know, I think this conversation has been really great, and will continue to serve folks beyond this moment as well. But thank you again, Koni and Andre, for being here. Folks can check out the book, the link in the chat, and maybe we'll get to see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Have a good day, y'all, or night.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Good night now. Goodbye.